So we've seen type annotation where we declare types for our variables, but there's also a concept called type assertion in TypeScript. So this is what we have seen so far. We have this cost variable, and then we have this type annotation where we say that this variable should be a string. And now TypeScript is going to infer the value that we have here, and TypeScript sees that this is a string, so this can be assigned to this variable. But then if I come here and I say cost equals to 400, TypeScript is going to infer this value, and it sees that the type of this value is a number, and so number cannot be assignable to type string. But then there are times where we want to tell the compiler the type of a value, and this is type assertion. Let me show you an example. Let's say we have this here. We have this lm variable, and this is document.getElement by id, and then we pass an id. Now in this case, getElement by id is going to return HTML element or null. So I can come here to explicitly say HTML elements or null. But then if I should use type annotation to say lm is going to be HTML element like this, we're going to have an error. This error says that type HTML element or null is not assignable to type HTML element. So we have here HTML element, but this function returns HTML element or null. But what if we're very sure that this ID exists and this is never going to return null? Then in that case, we can assert this value to a different type. And to do that, we would say as HTML element. This is a type assertion where we are telling TypeScript that it should treat the type of this value as this, and now this would match this HTML element here. And if I should remove this type annotation, you can see that lm is HTML element. But if I should remove this type assertion, you're going to see that lm is HTML element or null. One thing you probably realize here with type assertion is that it can be risky, because here you are telling the compiler that I don't want you to infer this for me. I want you to treat this as HTML element. So in a way, you are turning off the TypeScript check. So type assertion is something that you should do carefully, else you might run into runtime errors, which is one of the things that we have been avoiding in the first place. Now, if I should come here and I should say as number, TypeScript is going to tell us, nope, that kind of type assertion cannot work. And this is what TypeScript says. Conversion of HTML element null to type number may be a mistake because neither type sufficiently overlaps with the other. So because this returns HTML element or null, that is why TypeScript allows us to do as HTML element. TypeScript would also allow us to do as null, but then when we do something else, then TypeScript is going to say, no, I don't think this is possible. But then if we want to tell TypeScript, I don't care, then we can say as any, because HTML elements can also be any. So we can say as any, and then we can say as number. So now lm is going to be number. You can see how type assertions means we're telling TypeScript, forget whatever you're doing, this is what I want the type of this value to be. But again, this is dangerous because during runtime, if you should say lm.toFixed, which is supposed to only apply for numbers, that is going to throw an error because this is going to return a HTML element, and an HTML element does not have the toFixed method. Also coming to this example we have above. So what if I say let's cost number, and then we are assigning this string? What is happening here again is that TypeScript infers the type of this value as a string, but then a string cannot be assigned to this number variable. Well, here we can also use type assertion to say as number. Although this is not going to work again because TypeScript is going to say conversion of type string to type number may be a mistake because neither type sufficiently overlaps with the other. So what we can say here again is as any, as number. And now we're telling TypeScript, I want you to treat the type of this value as a number instead of inferring it as a string, which TypeScript will do automatically. Again, this is dangerous because we're telling TypeScript, we don't need your help. I am sure of what I'm doing. But in the case that I am not sure of what I'm doing, I might run into runtime errors. But let me show you an example where type assertion can be kind of safe. So let's say I have this type alias. Now I can come here to say const user info. Now when I use type annotation like this, TypeScript is going going to say that type this is missing the following properties: name and staff code. It means I cannot have an empty object here. Even if I wanted to come back later to say user.name Deeecode or something, this is still going to have an error because I have an empty object here. When you do type annotation with objects like this, it means you need to provide all of the required properties, which means I have to provide the name and I have to provide the staff code. I can still come back later on to change the name to something else if I wanted. But then what if I actually want this to be an empty object, so that later on I can do user.name equals this and user.staffcode equals 400? Well, in that case, instead of using type annotation, I would use type assertion. So I'm going to say const user equals this, but then instead of TypeScript inferring the type of this to be an empty object, I'm going to tell TypeScript, or telling the compiler, that I want you to treat this value as user info. I can now have my user annotation here like this, and you can see that this works fine. Or I can just take this out and user is still going to be user info. And now I can do user.name equals this and user.staffcode equals this. And if I try to do user.something else, we're going to have an error that something else does not exist on type user info. So with type annotation, I cannot provide the empty object like this, but when I assert this empty object to a different type, telling the compiler treat this as user info, now everything works fine. Now the reason why I say using type assertion like this is still kind of safe is that if I declare only user.name but I don't declare user.staffcode, TypeScript is not going to throw any warnings because we've already told TypeScript that treat this as user info. So that means if I should come here now and I should say user.staffcode.toFixed, and let's say we pass 20, if I run this with TS node, type assertion /index.ts, we're going to have a runtime error. And this error is coming from the fact that cannot read properties of undefined, reading to fixed. Why? Because user.staffcode is undefined, because we only declared for the name property. We don't have a value for staff code, so that property does not exist. So this is basically saying undefined.toFixed 20. Happening at runtime, we get an error here. So this is why I said with type assertion, you are turning off some TypeScript features which can affect you in runtime. So unless you really need to do a type assertion, you should avoid it. You should allow TypeScript figure out the type of the value for you and see if it matches your annotation. Take this back with the type annotation and I remove this. TypeScript is going to force me to provide these values, name and staff code. And now if I run user.staffcode.toFixed, this is going to work fine.